Thank you very much. Firstly, can I just say that it actually is a very personal honour to be here today. I've been involved in the bill as it was from its initiation in 2012 right through to when it was passed. And it's a great honour to be here today talking to all of the stakeholders who are so intrinsically involved in the rental sector. As Ross said, 1 in 5 individuals in this country is now renting, and that doesn't take into account the number of landlords as well. And I'd also wholeheartedly agree with the statement about there's no such thing as a huge cohort of bad landlords and bad tenants, and it's really a situation where we're now moving towards a situation where long-term residential accommodation is going to be a key factor of Irish life. What I'm going to try and talk to you about this afternoon is twofold. The first part is just really an overview of where the Residential Tenancies Board came from, its genesis and where it is now. And we'll get onto some more technical issues around rent certainty. I think there are in the audience, I know that there's going to be lots and lots of questions. So what I'll try and do is, and whenever a lawyer says this, I think you can say it with a pinch of salt, take it with a pinch of salt, but I'm going to try and be as brief as possible and not ramble on and go into the intricacies of various provisions of the legislation, but instead to give you an overview of those issues, and then we can have hopefully an informed and a lively debate. So the first point is that there are the main provisions of, and we've touched this as well. So prior to 2004, there was no Residential Tenancies Board, no private Residential Tenancies Board, and the court dealt with disputes, delays and costs. And as a litigator and someone who is in the courts regularly, let me tell you that a dispute before the PRTB is substantially quicker than a dispute in the Circuit Court or a dispute before the High Court. And I know while the RTB will strive to reduce their time limits and their time periods, that it is substantially quicker. There was no regulation of rent, and unless the procedures were set out in a lease. And really a tenancy could be terminated without any reason. So tenants had minimal rights in this jurisdiction. There was very short notice periods. There was virtually no remedies for tenants. There was limited information on the size and makeup of the private rented sector. And there was no regulation of the landlord and tenant relationship. So all of those issues that Roz has touched across this morning about what the PRTB do, that was all absent from this sector just 12 short years ago. So we've seen a huge sea change. So what has the 2004 Act actually done? It's brought forward a cost-effective dispute resolution process. You don't have to go before a PRTB adjudicator or tribunal armed with your solicitor, a junior counsel, a senior counsel, for it to take days and days. You can have a quick and easy dispute resolution process, and you also now have telephone mediations as well. We also have security of tenure, and I know it's a political issue, but there is, with a Part 4 tenancy, after 6 months, you do have a certain ground of security of tenure. And there are specific and statutory grounds on which your tenancy can be terminated. And they are very specific, they're very stringent, and they must be abided by. A notice of termination, which is contained in Section 62 of the Act, is a statutory notice, it's a statutory document, and it's a very important document to get right. And I know that there are certainly landlords in the room who find it a source of frustration, but its genesis is there to ensure good regulation of the sector and to ensure that tenants' rights. We also now have a definition of market rent. The rights and obligations of tenants and landlords are clearly defined, they're defined in the Act. And we have a tenancy registration system as well. So what has the 2015 Act done? We have a 24-month period now between rent reviews, and I'm going to come on to that in greater detail. for the approved housing body, and I know there's many people in the audience today who are from the approved housing bodies and are getting to grips now with this new form of regulation. As part of this is a 90-day rent review notice. Also, crucially, there's an extension in relation to the termination provisions. So there's a pro rata extension on termination of notice. So the notice that must be given to a tenant in order to terminate the tenancy is dependent on how long the tenant has been in the property. And again, this goes back to the idea of making sure and ensuring the tenants have security of tenure to the greatest degree possible, while balancing that with the landlord's rights to their properties. We have a slip rule concerning notice of termination as well. My colleague Keith has the great pleasure of discussing that. It's certainly a difficult topic. We also now have free mediation. And there's a 10-day cooling off period in relation to mediations and agreements. And as I mentioned, we now have approved housing bodies which have come in. So it's no longer the private residential tenancies board, we now have the residential tenancies board, which is for all residential tenancies in the country. There are a number of provisions which have yet to be commenced, and they will be commenced over the coming months and years. One is the enforcement of the termination orders through the district court. Currently they're enforced through the circuit court. Another is a deposit protection scheme. And then there's also a sliding scale for registering a tenancy in terms of the late penalties. In relation to approved housing bodies, there is a requirement to register within 1 year of commencement. I believe the commencement date is the 7th of April from the top of my head. There is now an access to dispute resolution services for approved housing bodies. And I suppose one thing that I can say for those members of the approved housing body community that are here today is, while this new regulation may seem daunting, and it may seem as if there is a plethora of new obligations on you, there is a significant benefits as well that you now have this access to dispute resolution services for one, where you can go and where any disputes between your body and your tenants can be resolved. The general rule is that what we call the RTA, which is the Residential Tenancies Act, so it's the Residential Tenancies Act 2004 to 2015, applies to AHBs, affordable housing bodies. There are some exemptions. A premises can't be sublet by one of the tenants. There is a no white goods requirement, which is a requirement that you don't have to have certain infrastructure in the property, such as fridges, freezers, etc. And the rent isn't the same market rent, if we can call it that, as it is in the private sector. There's a rent review once in every 12 months. So while in the private sector the rent review it can be carried out every 24 months, the rent review is once in 12 months. And there's also a provision for transitional tenancies, which are no longer than 18 months. The affordable housing bodies will also be subject to the deposit protection scheme once it has been commenced. Some further measures which have yet to be commenced are the reduced late penalty fees. Currently there's a fee of €90 to register a tenancy, which then doubles to 180 if it's late. And what this act does, what this provision does, is tries to bring some fairness to that. So if you are, let's say, a month late, should you have to pay the same amount as somebody who is 6 months late? So there is a €20 sliding scale depending on when you register. The RTB, and you'll have to excuse me, I keep on referring to the PRTB. The RTB will set incentives for online registrations and for further Part 4 tenancy. So we talked about this idea at the very start of a Part 4 tenancy, which is a tenancy where after 6 months in occupation, the tenant has a right to a tenancy for 4 years. If that continues, they may have a further Part 4 tenancy. And for landlords, there will be no registration fees for further Part 4 tenancies. This brings me on to the tricky and thorny subject now of rent certainty. So what has now come true is that there is a 24-month freeze on rent reviews. So what that means is for that 24-month period, the tenant is entitled to know exactly how much rent that they will be required to pay for that period of time. For the approved housing body sector, that's 12 months. Crucially, if you enter into a tenancy on today's date, that tenancy, the rent for that tenancy cannot be reviewed within 2 years of the start of that tenancy. So that tenant has a 2-year period of absolute certainty in order how much they'll have to pay for rent. And on the flip side, a landlord will know exactly how much they are expected and they are going to receive in rent for the next 2 years. So it does work in both ways. When I say the 24-month period as a form of retrospective effect, this also, generally legislation will start from the day in which it's enacted, and those provisions will only become law from that day. The legislature, the Oireachtas, have put in a very specific provision here that if in the last year you carried out a rent review, so in 2015, let's say you carried out a rent review, on the 1st of June 2015, you cannot carry out another rent review until the 1st of June 2017. So you have that retrospective element to it as well. The rent can't be more than the market rent, and this is the same as the previous position. So the rent always had to be what the market rent was. A rent review notice is in a prescribed form, and I actually have a slide with it as well. And 90 days notice must be provided. Crucially, I think this has, and it was described as a sunshine clause, is that this 24-month period of rent certainty is for 4 years. So when these 4 years passes, it will revert back to being 12 months. And if my maths are correct, I think that's 2020. We spoke about the rent, the notice of rent. And the landlord must provide their tenants with a notice stating what the new rent is going to be, the date it is to have effect. It must be signed by the landlord and their authorised agent, and include a statement, as you can see there, that if the tenant disagrees that that is not the market rent, they may refer a dispute to the RTB within 28 days. It must also include a statement from the landlord that in their opinion, the new rent is not greater than the market rent, having regard to 2 essential matters: the terms of the tenancy and the letting values of dwellings of a similar size, type and character situated in a comparable area to that in which the dwelling is situated. Now, I live in Dublin 8, and there's numerous houses in Dublin 8, and there's numerous properties for sale and for rent in Dublin 8. And I think it's quite, I live in a 3-bed terraced house, and if I went on daft.ie or one of those websites in the morning, I've no doubt but that I could find 3 properties that were exactly the same as mine, and I'd have no problem filling out that declaration. And one of the queries that we've had that's come in is, what if I live in a rural area and there aren't premises which are of a comparable size or nature near me in Skibbereen in County Cork? And I think the wording that the Oireachtas has put forward, that it's a similar size, type and character, and it says a comparable area. So it doesn't say the same area, it's a comparable area. So if you can find an area that is of a similar rural character to the premises that you're letting, I think in those circumstances, that is the information that you would put forward in your notice. as I said, you have to specify the amount of rent sought for 3 dwellings. And the amount of rent sought it can't be information that you have been provided by anecdotally. So if you're at your local GAA club, if you're in your local pub, if you're talking to friends and they say, oh, well, the house down the road is going for €500 a month, that is not what the amount of rent sought is. It has to be an advertisement, the date of which is with 4 weeks immediately prior before the notice is served. So it's comparable data, it's up-to-date data, and it's data that actually shows what the market is at the moment. This is the sample notice of rent review, which is the PRTB have put up on their website. And you can see that it's a notice that's has been designed to be easy to use. One of the things that I just wanted to touch on before I hand it over to Keith is the whole idea of, there has been some question about whether it's 24 months or actually 27 months. The rent review, in our view, and one of the things I should say is that this legislation, like all legislation, is open to interpretation. Legislation really only is embedded when there's a High Court decision or a Supreme Court decision in relation to it, and there hasn't been one as of yet. But our view is that if you have an existing tenancy and you have your first rent review, and we'll say that it happened on the 1st of January 2016, your second rent review can occur. You would serve the notice on the 1st of January 2016, and 90 days later, which is the 90 days that I discussed, that is when the actual rent takes effect. So therefore, from the 1st of April of 2016 right through to the 1st of April 2018, the tenant will know exactly how much rent they have to pay. I know sometimes when you give figures and dates in an abstract way, it can be slightly complicated, so I might just repeat that. If on the 1st of January I decide I want to raise or to change the rent, I carry out my research and I serve my notice on the 1st of January 2016. 90 days after I serve that, which is the 1st of April, the rent takes effect. And then for the next 2 years, until the 1st of April 2018, that rent is the rent that is payable for that property. There is the question mark about what actually constitutes a rent review. And in our view, what constitutes a rent review is actually carrying out the research of the comparable dwellings within the last 4 months, drafting the notice and serving it. And the date of service is the date of the rent review and when that ends. So I just want to discuss finally one other analogy. And that's when I have a new tenancy. And my new tenancy starts on the 1st of January 2016. And I set a rent of €1,000 for that tenancy. I am obliged to keep that rent at €1,000 for the next 2 years, which brings me to the 1st of January 2018. And on the 1st of January 2018, I can then serve a rent review notice. My tenant has 90 days within which to consider it. It can appeal it to the PRTB if it wants, and that becomes effective on the 1st of April 2018. So there is the way the Act is drafted, there is a slight anomaly where you have an existing tenancy that's already in place and where you have a new tenancy. I can't tell you if that's the intention of the legislature and if that's what they wanted to happen. We have looked at this in every way, upwards and backwards and however you'd like to describe it, and that is certainly from an analysis of the provisions of the Act, if that is how it will work, is that essentially the tenant will have a 27-month rent certainty period. So they will have 24 months from the date on which they commence their tenancy, and then they will have that extra 90 days after I have served my notice. I hope, and I have tried to make that as clear as possible, potentially in the abstract. I'm more than happy to answer any questions on this. I think it's, certainly from the feedback that I've got from the executive, I think it's one of the key issues that people have been asking about, how exactly this rent review is going to work, and what the provisions are. So more than happy to, as I said at the questions and answer session, to answer any questions that you have on it. And I hope I've explained that to at least a varying level of certainty. So I'd just again like to thank you very much for your time and for your attention. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague Keith Underwood now. Thank you.